The alien didn't understand the word stop, and that single failure to translate reshaped everything the mission thought it knew about contact. Veera came up from the black like a promise. From orbit, the planet was a coin of blue and white, 2 moons, a scatter of silver clouds, a surface threaded with veins of bioluminescent green that pulsed faintly even against the glare of its primary. As their descent module cut through the upper atmosphere, Salana watched the world unroll beneath them, forests that shimmered as if backlit by thousands of tiny suns, low mountains crowned with what looked like mist, but smelled, impossibly, of citrus and old rain. She had expected wonder. She had not expected to feel it like a physical thing, settling in the hollow under her ribs. Jack stood 2 paces behind her on the landing platform, gloves unclipped, jaw set. He had been useful on 10 previous missions. Steady hands, quick patches, a readiness that made him the person people turned to when something went wrong. But history lived in the tension between them. Folded shirts, ruined promises, reconnaissance evenings turned to arguments. The ship's logs listed them as co-leads for the first sweep. Salana listed it as a professional arrangement, and something much messier beneath that. They were not alone. A skeleton crew followed their boots into the shallow forest. Engineers with blue-lit rigs, a linguist with a mouthful of notes, a botanist who kept whispering the names of things she could not yet name. The planet hummed against their suits, a subtle vibration under the soles like a second heartbeat. By the time the team found the cave, the sky had lowered into a peculiar dusk. The cave's mouth was rimmed with crystalline growths that refracted the faint light into active threads, and from within rose a pulse of energy, warm, rhythmic. The sensors spiked but did not translate. The linguist, Veera, put her palm to one of the crystalline ribs and smiled like someone touching a living thing. Salana kept her hands to herself. She had a protocol and a list of hypotheses, and more than a little faith. Curiosity tasted sweeter than fear. They advanced. The air within the cave was thick with phosphorescent spores that dusted their visors in slow particulate storms. In the center of a hollow, amid a ring of flowering plants that glowed a soft azure, there was a figure, tall, somehow older than its features suggested, moving like water folding. It did not resemble anything catalogued in their databanks. Its skin, if that was skin, radiated faint bioluminescence, and along its arms patterns shifted, bands of light flowing like script. It regarded them with a patient, unhurried intelligence. It was Nirth. Nirth did not open its mouth to speak. Communication came as motion, hands painting the air in arcs, ripples of light sending small, visible thought swirls that the bioluminescent flora picked up and echoed. I felt the hum of it through my boots. Jack's hand tightened on his rig behind her, more protective than a professional precaution. The first exchange was a gift. Nirth extended one of those glowing flowers, small, doubled petals, a nucleus of light, and hovered it before Salana. It was not an offering in the human sense. It was a thing with intent, a social algorithm translated into biology. Salana took it with both hands. The flower gave off a warmth that mapped to something like welcome. When she placed it against her chest, a ripple of lights on Nirth matched it. The team's translator hummed, failing to place lexical meaning around such an act, but Salana understood in a way that bypassed words. Days threaded into one another like the rings on the cave ceiling. Salana returned each morning. She learned how to move with the planet's rhythm, how to breathe when the plants exhaled a sweet, faint vapor, how to translate Nirth's gestures into rough English equivalents, how to read the slow language of the glowing flora. In answer, Nirth began to mirror certain human habits. It began to nest small luminescent threads in Salana's hair, making patterns like a crown, and repeated a downward arc with its palm whenever she left, its way of saying, perhaps, remember. It was not perfect communication, but it wasn't silent either. Salana kept a small pillow of the glowing petals in her quarters, and more than once pressed it to her face in the ship's sterile dark. The connection was not erotic. It was an exchange of curiosity and trust, a student accepting a tutor's gift. Still, to Jack, who watched these exchanges more and more from the periphery, those same petals became proof of something he could not name and did not like. The change in Jack was small at first. He stopped joining the morning excursions. He chewed through reports in the ship's dim lounge, sleeves rolled, eyes darting to who left with Salana and who came back. When he did come to the cave, his attention was clinical. Notes, tethering lines, a set of gloves he kept to his chest like armor. He asked questions that were thinly veiled commands. He suggested a containment schema. He protested when Salana refused to biopsy a particular organism, insisting that the data was more important than the romanticizing of a guardian creature. Salana tried to meet him halfway. She reminded him that the mission demanded both data and diplomacy. She explained why forced samples could sever trust they would never repair. Jack listened like someone reading the weather and finding no shelter. That night, she found his boots in the storage alcove, not where he'd left them, and a strand of one of her luminescent petals tucked into a leather pocket. Her stomach dropped, part accusation, part fear, because she knew Jack had done something on impulse and meant to protect, not panic, and those impulses had edges she could not control. He did not confide in colleagues, he confided in himself.
He walked the outer rim of Veera at odd hours, staring at the moon's twin reflection on the marshes, rehearsing the ways to make things right. The plan formed slow as FOST, information control, a way of forcing a goodbye by removing the instrument of mutual understanding. If Nirth could not be trusted with the right to roam where the saplings fend the river, then containment would be necessary. If Salana grew too close, he would make sure she remembered human caution. On the morning that altered the mission, the air had a higher pitch. The plants pulsed in tight, quick beats. Nirth came to the surface earlier than usual, trailing a web of faint blue threads. Salana was there, of course, picking the petals, pressing them into the translator, telling Mira what she felt. Nirth reached for her in a way that had become ritual, an offering of light, an attempt to align frequencies with Salana's heartbeat so it could map the contours of human emotion. It was a benign contact, practiced through days of trial and error. At the moment it touched the pads of her glove with a luminous filament, a gesture the team had only seen once before, Salana felt something smaller and more intimate than curiosity bloom: knowledge. It was like a word forming in a language she had not been taught and then immediately understanding it. Her breath caught. "Stop," she said. She did not shout. Her voice was trained and steady. The word carried a clear boundary in every protocol she had been handed. The team had rehearsed emergency halts and hold positions. Salana had spoken stop to malfunctioning equipment, to flaring specimens, to colleagues trying to test unknown reactions. It was the word that shut things down. It was the word that cautioned. Nirth continued its motion. It did not pause. The filament tightened, not cruelly, but like a tether being drawn around something that had suddenly made the whole world interesting. The light along Nirth's arms rearranged, cascades forming a new pattern. To Salana's glove, the filament felt curious and engrossing. To her team, who could not see the subtle educative exchange meaningfully, it looked like an embrace that refused to end. Someone exhaled. Someone whooped nervously, because that was the reflex. "Stop," Salana said again, firmer, threading the command through her translator. The device chirped, a line of code attempting to map Salana's utterance to interspecies equivalents. The linguist Mira leaned in, eyes wide, fingers on the console trying to reroute the translation's prioritization. The machine's lights fluttered, but could not find a precedent for that word among Nirth's gestures. Nirth did not have the lexeme. Its communicative structures had no direct analog for halt as a safety command. Its world built meaning differently, through rhythm, reciprocity, the offer and return of light. Jack moved then. He had a containment field rig slung over his shoulder, its mesh designed to dampen bioluminescent signaling.
He had quarried the field from their emergency designs after nights of thinking. If a being was dangerous, you isolated it. If it was invasive, you closed the loops that fed it. He meant to place the field between Nirth and the cave, a barricade. He meant to reclaim the order he feared losing. He triggered it too quickly. The field's mesh blossomed between Salana and Nirth, not quite enclosing the Guardian, but intercepting its filament. The filament recoiled as if shocked. Nirth's pattern stuttered and reconfigured into something sharp. The flora around them flared in alarm. The spores rose like silver moths. The cave hummed with a new, urgent frequency. For the crew, the scene was a cascade of panic. Nirth's back arched, the plant's glow intensified, and the filament that had rested on Salana's glove snaked and expanded, suddenly thicker, encircling her forearm and, in the crew's terrified view, moving up toward the shoulder. Salana, tethered but not harmed, felt the filament's pressure through her suit. It was not forceful in the way a human hand could be. It was a censorship of motion, a pressing that said, continue, remain, and in its own lexicon might have been an attempt to hold longer so the pattern could be completed. For Salana, it felt like being held in a sentence. Something moved behind them, a hiss from the ship's static as systems tried to rebalance. Nirth's light pitch rose and rose until it scraped against the top of the crew's nerves. The translators coughed on decimals. The botanist's face showed white-lined fear. Jack's eyes, raw with an urge to fix, tracked between his instrument and Salana's gloved wrist. "Stop," Salana said again, louder, and not just as a halt to the contact, but a fissure in the whole miscommunication. Her body registered alarm. Her voice had the meal ticket weight of every language she'd ever used in emergencies. It was meant to be universal. It was not. It was a failure of translation.
a semantic gap between instincts etched over eons and a single human imperative wrapped in fragile technology. Fear spread, fast, contagious. Some of the crew wanted to fire warning shots, others screamed to deploy sedatives. Mira's hands flew over the linguistics console, trying a patchwork of phonemes and gestures, mapping the concept of boundary onto the patterns of Nirth's light. There is no human likeness for the sensation of watching translation collapse. Salana's heart felt like it might be a third instrument in the cave's symphony. She had seconds, counted, breath-held seconds, to fix the thing that words could not reach. She remembered the first exchange, the flower she had pressed to her heart. She reached for it now, fingers fumbling, and pulled the glowing petal from the pocket of her suit. It had been with her the whole time, warm and faint. She had learned, days before, a non-verbal pact. When she presented the petal and placed it gently against Nirth's chest, Nirth would mirror the gesture and release pattern. The token meant surrendering a piece of curiosity in exchange for trust. It meant, in Nirth's terms, completion. Salana raised the petal in one hand, and with the other worked through the gesture she and Nirth had shaped together, an arc with her palm, a pause at the throat, then a lowering, and the slow folding of an offering into itself. She spoke too, but not with stop. She pushed sound into tones learned with Nirth, a hum that matched the Guardian's stabilizing frequency. The translator, at the brink of collapse, caught a sliver and displayed a patchwork. Offering. Pause. Mutuality. Nirth's light shivered. The filament around Salana's arm loosened like a hand releasing a held thing. The vines bowed. The cave's pitch dropped one notch. Nirth stepped back, the mesh buckling harmlessly to the floor. It did not seem angry. It seemed relieved, or maybe merely curious about the riddle of humans. There was a pause, the kind you get after you run too fast and stop. Lungs racing, processors whirring, a dozen small decisions made in the span of a heartbeat. Jack's shoulders slumped, his containment field rolled back to silence. He planted his hands on his knees and breathed, looking at Salana as if seeing for the first time the woman he had loved and the scientist he had doubted. The linguistics console lit up with a single, simple translation. Boundary achieved through token reciprocity. There was no direct word for stop in Nirth's language, Mira said later, her voice low. The creature used a suite of reciprocating signals. It understood the concept when framed as a pattern of offer and return, rather than a categorical halt. Salana had learned the pattern. Jack had not. When the immediate panic eased, the crew carried out the debrief they were built to do. Data logs, spectral readings, a careful inventory of what had happened and why.
The sample of the filament showed no aggressive cellular design, just a connective tissue that linked information between plant and Guardian. The botanist argued for an olive branch adjustment in protocol. Teach Nirth a glyph or token for pause that could be reinforced with the petal. Mira argued for translation models built around gestures rather than phonemes. Salana, exhausted, argued for patient engagement and a harder line on unilateral action. Jack argued in other ways. He argued with himself in quarters, hand pressed to the wall, resolving what he felt into an action. He had tampered with the field's safety failsafe before the incursion, small calibrations meant to ensure that the mesh would not deploy in a way that might injure Nirth. He had not meant harm, he had meant control. If he allowed the team to build a story in which Nirth was ungoverned, he could shape the consequence. He had thought, selfishly, of returning to the ship alongside Salana as the person who had kept her and thus kept what had been theirs in a pre-mission life. This is the thing that makes a villain, not malice alone, but a tangled knot of fear and longing. When the commander's forum opened, Jack's changes to the mesh parameters were visible in the logs. They were sloppy, too quick, a name in the chain of custody, a timestamp. No one liked to discipline someone for protecting what they could not name, but the ledger does not forgive rashness wrapped in care. The ship's captain removed Jack from lead duties for the remainder of the sweep, a sanction that was heavy for him and properly weighted for the mission. He apologized to Salana in a quiet hallway, the two of them alone under the ship's blue lamp hum. She listened. She spoke of boundaries and curiosity and the ethics that the mission had sworn to honor. Jack's apology was not the closing of a wound. It was the beginning of a long, necessary unraveling. Nirth retreated to the cave over the following days, but did not vanish. It left patterns on the floor, new rings of light, a carefully placed line of petals that no human hand had set down. Salana, when she approached, mirrored the ceremonial offering without the intrusive instruments.
Each time, the guardian matched her gesture, and the rhythm slowed until the cave thrummed back to its earlier lullaby. The crew adapted. No unilateral actions, no intrusive sampling, more patience. Mira put together a small set of glyphs, a ring for reciprocity, a flattening palm for pause, that the team used to train the translator's pattern bank. The incident became a lesson, filed in everyone's head like a mural, that languages are ecosystems, and that a single missing word can unmake understanding. For Salana, the lesson was double-edged. She had been held because she had been covered in light and curiosity, and the planet had no map for the human imperative of stop.
She had handled it because she had sat on the cave floor long enough, offering a petal again and again until the pattern looped. She had been the bridge, and bridges carry weight. For Jack, the consequences were quieter and slower. The crew did not exile him. They watched him. He made amends in small things. He recalibrated the mesh correctly. He walked the perimeter for hours. He documented every step. He spoke at length with the linguists about consent and risk. He did not take back the way he had moved in the cave, acting like a shepherd with a birthstone of possessiveness. But he did, finally, sit in a debrief and say aloud that he had been wrong to change the safeguards without debate. Salana forgave him in an adult way, not a sweeping return to what they had before, but an acknowledgement that this was now a shared tale. The crevices of their history remained. Trust, once betrayed, requires repeated, honest actions to heal. The team supported that healing by setting up protocols that valued bilateral consent, human gesture matched by Nearth's token exchange, a translator feed that prioritized gesture patterns over phonemic mapping, and a schedule of shared observations meant to keep curiosity communal instead of possessive. Night on Veera was different now. The two moons lit the caverns with a gentler blue. At the mouth of the cave, Nearth sometimes waited at dusk, a silhouette among bioluminescent stems, watching the ship's lights recede. Salana would stand with a small handful of petals, offering them in a gesture that had become a prayerless liturgy. Present the token, lower the palm, a pulse of reciprocation. Sometimes, when the world seemed particularly fragile, she would sit with Nearth in silence and let the cave teach her a language of pauses. The mission file marked the incident not as an isolated crisis, but as an inflection point. Protocols were rewritten not to contain the alien, but to contain hubris. The planet's ecology was acknowledged as an actor, not a resource. Jack's name remained on the logs, annotated with a note that read, "Disciplinary action taken, further review pending." The crew kept working. Discovery does not forgive moral ambivalence. Salana stayed on Veera for the long sweep, partly because she believed in the science, and partly because she had given the petals their meaning and could not unlearn that exchange. At the end of the first lunar cycle, Salana stood on a ridge above the cave and watched Nearth move among the stems like a slow current. The air smelled of recent rain and the distant tang of the ship's engines. She held the last petal she had been given at the beginning of the mission. It felt small and honest between her fingers. She thought of the moment where words broke and gestures closed the gap, and she thought of how easy it is for human fear to become an instrument of harm, even when dressed as protection.
She thought of Jack and of the apology that landed like a small stone skimming on water, creating rings that might one day reach ashore. She thought of the crew, of the linguist who'd slept under a blanket of schematics, of Mira's hands always stained faintly with light from her console, of the botanist whose whispers had named each new sprout. And she thought always of the thing that had started it, a word that had no weight in Nearth's world. The day they uploaded their initial report to Mission Control, the file began with a single line Salana insisted upon. Language is not merely a tool, it is a life form. She argued that the title of their internal briefing, "The Alien Didn't Understand the Word Stop," was not a condemnation but a compass. It would shape every instruction that followed. When the team recorded the incident formally, they allowed room for humility. They documented the exact seconds of failure, the gestures that fixed the moment, the emotional and procedural fallout. They committed to teaching the planet's token language as a mutual practice, not to domesticate Nearth, but to meet it halfway. Late that night, Salana opened the ship's log in the quiet of her cabin and typed a line to close the incident's file. She hesitated, then added a question, not for Mission Control, but for whoever might read their public feed years from now. If you had to teach a single thing to a mind utterly unlike your own, what would you teach first? She did not prescribe the answer. She left it as a pebble on the shore.
Outside, through the porthole, Veera breathed its blue light over the world. Nurth's silhouette was a slow punctuation at the cave's rim, patient, old, and not unkind. The petals in Salana's hand were cool. She placed one against her palm, folded her fingers over it, and let it glow against the inside of her wrist. It matched the beat of her pulse, a tiny, shared language. They had discovered something fundamental on Veera, that boundaries require translation, and that sometimes the only way to teach a word like stop is to show what it means. That night, Salana slept with a petal on her pillow, and the knowledge that translation is not only mechanical, it is moral. The alien had not understood the word. They had together found a way to teach it. If this reached you and the question at the end lingers, tell them, what would you teach an alien first? Share your answer below.